Sure, if you'd like. Yeah. And I got the agenda that I will pull up here.
And how many people are we expecting?
I think most of the working group members.
Remind me who's on the working group.
Yeah, so yeah, you, Tara, I think Jamie is gone.
Everyone who's in your invite, basically.
Yeah, in the
Okay.
calendar invite.
Yep. So even though Jamie is no longer, did he resign or?
He is still continuing to serve in his seat until he's replaced, but he could also continue to participate as a working group member, as just a member of the public, if he's interested. All right, looks like we, and let me go ahead and disable the waiting room so that people don't get stuck in that filter. Hello, everyone.
Hey, everybody.
Andy, can you hear? Can you check sound?
Yeah, Natalia, I can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, thanks.
So I guess we'll just wait until a few minutes till everyone arrives, Andy.
Yep. And let's see, who may need to be sharing slides? I think that is.
Probably me, maybe.
Yep.
Oh, man.
But it looks like I have the ability to make all participants sharing. So I'm just going to do that. Do you want to test, Cynthia, and see if you can share? I will. In the meantime, I'm pulling up the agenda and I will share that momentarily. You should get immediately. Yep. Okay. I'm seeing yours start to go. Perfect. All right. I will share my screen. Okay. Are you seeing my PDF with the working group agenda?
Yeah.
Great. Hold on a sec. Something is happening with my Zoom. You guys still hear me?
Yep, I will say that I couldn't get in with one link, but I could get in with another link.
Sorry, folks. Zoom hiccup there. Didn't like my shared screen for a sec. All right. Well, Joe, I think we've got the critical mass. You want to kick us off as chair? Your
Sure.
first official meeting capacity?
Oh, welcome everybody. And I guess this is our second meeting for the Offshore Wind Work Group, for OPAC's Offshore Wind Work Group. And just a quick run through, I guess we could do introductions if needed. I guess we could go quickly around and popcorn it. I'm Joe Liebezeit. I'm with the Bird Alliance of Oregon, also serve on OPAC as a statewide conservation representative. And yeah, I'll pass it to Andy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Andy Lanier, Marine Affairs Coordinator with DLCD, and I'm going to pass it to Justin.
Hey, good afternoon. Justin Ainsworth, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I manage the Marine Resources Program. Cynthia?
Hello, everybody. Cynthia Smith. I'm with DLCD as the Offshore Wind Policy Specialist. And I will pass it to Natalia. We can't hear you.
Yeah, for some reason now, Natalia.
Can you hear me?
Now we
Yeah,
can.
we hear you now.
You cannot?
Yes, we
Yeah.
can hear you.
Wow, it's interesting. So, Natalia Strunatka, hello everyone, submerged cable analyst within Department of State Land. And I will pass to who is on the list, Jeff.
Everybody, Jeff Burright, I'm with DLCD. I'm the Offshore Wind Roadmap Coordinator.
All
Who's
right, and then
left?
let's go to Dick Van der Schaaf. Oh, and Laurel after you.
Hello, everybody. Dick Van der Schaaf with the Nature Conservancy, just sitting in. I'm along with Gina Carter, working on backing the offshore wind roadmap process here in Oregon. Thanks.
Thanks, Dick.
Laurel?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Laurel Hillman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department.
And last is Kate.
I'm a professor at Cal State Los Angeles, and I'm just observing the public aspects of wind energy in Oregon.
Right. Well, welcome everybody. So just a quick overview of the agenda. It's a pretty short agenda, but we're going to dig into certain parts of it in more detail. So first up, Jeff from DLCD will give an update on the Offshore Wind Roadmap activities. We just had a meeting recently, so Jeff can provide an update. And then we'll switch to Cynthia at DLCD to do a deeper dive on the policy gap summary. And you all should have received that document. I think it was about 8 pages, very small font in the email. So if you've had a chance to take a look at it. So Cynthia will walk us through that, and then there'll be a public comment, and then we'll end the meeting by 3 p.m. If there's any other agenda items people have, I guess you can say anything now. Okay, with that, I will assume there are not any other agenda items, and we can let Jeff take it over.
Thanks, everybody. So yeah, I think the last time we all spoke was late April. I was on the North Coast, just about to have the first of our community meetings along the coast. The purpose of those was to essentially catch members of the public up to the conversation that had been going on for the last, at that point, 4 or 5 months with the Offshore Wind Roadmap and the roundtable that we established to advise us on developing that roadmap. Now, our roundtable has been meeting since November, and we just adjourned for the summer after our June meeting. Was that last week? So that I can spend some time doing some writing and just integrating all the feedback we've been receiving. But after our meeting, we had the meeting here. We had our first public meeting up in Seaside, and it was a fairly small group, but a great conversation. People just interested to learn more, and I think surprised to come to an understanding that, you know, this roadmap is really for the entire state of Oregon, because all places off the coast of Oregon are potentially viable for offshore wind development. You know, the focus is not just on the South Coast. Then a month later, we went to Brookings and we had a combined meeting. First, we met with local planning staff from city and county down there as part of our enforceable policy assessment that Cynthia has been spearheading, working with all of the local governments along the coast to try to understand what their effects of concern might be or interest, and kind of a policy gap analysis. We then had another public meeting in Brookings. We had 30 or so people attending, and there were, I think, some vocal concerns expressed at that meeting about offshore wind generally, and I think just an understanding of our process that didn't quite get that, this is the state's opportunity to set the stage for any future offshore wind. But gave us some feedback there. And then the next day we had a roundtable meeting at the community college there, where for the first time we discussed a discussion draft of the roadmap. I intended for it to be 10 pages, but it turned out to be 46 pages, really just trying to capture the conversations that have happened to date among the roundtable group. And that draft is available on our website. And we talked through the various sections, got some early feedback, and then invited people to provide us written feedback ahead of a June meeting. So then come to June, we had our third and final in-person community meeting in North Bend on June 16th. We had about 55 people in attendance and a lot of good questions, a lot of people just coming interested to learn more about where things are with offshore wind and the opportunity with the roadmap. And then the next day, we had our final roadmap meeting for this phase, where we talked through the regulatory process. I gave a in-depth overview of how it would work in the state if we proceeded as far as a construction operations plan where an actual project would be proposed. We also talked about the workforce aspects of offshore wind and had a panel discussing that. And then I'm trying to remember, we had another long topic that I can't recall. I think it was just kind of talking through the feedback that we had received between May and June to make sure that, generally speaking, we were on the right track for me to then take the summer to flesh out the 45-pager into a full draft roadmap. And the intent would be we bring the roundtable back together around September and start then working through the full document and having a series of meetings to talk through any areas of disagreement, questioning, more information needed, etc. So that's been what's been going on so far. There are a couple other things to know. One is that House Bill 3963, which was in the legislature this session to give DLCD an extra year for development of the roadmap, has passed both the House and the Senate and is now on for the governor's signature. 3963 would give us until the end of 2026 to produce a roadmap, but if we were ready and we'd gone through all of our process before then, we certainly could. And there's, I think, some motivation that whatever goes in the roadmap, that be available for the legislature ahead of the next session that would come after that in 27. About that. Oh, it would be a no-cost extension. So we're just gonna roll with the funding that we have, but we've been efficient enough that we think we can support some additional meetings of the roadmap, and our plan is to put that roadmap out for formal public comment next year. I'd like to do another run of meetings along the coast, but we need to look at our budget and capabilities to do that. Coming up, we are going to do a couple more public meetings. The first one is on July 9th at 5:30 in the evening. This is a virtual public meeting that is essentially the same as the in-person only meetings that we had along the coast. We realized that there's benefit in broadening our reach there. And so we put out a notice on it yesterday or the day before, and I'm working on further outreach there, trying to get people into that meeting. And the following day, July 10th, we're going to host a pair of virtual meetings, one at noon and one at 5:30. And these meetings are really focused on the fishing community. We have members of our roundtable that represent the fishing community, various parts of that community. And I've also been doing outreach with the commodity commissions in the state. And I spoke with the Pacific Fishery Management Council a couple of weeks ago, and I'm trying to get on their agenda at a future meeting to discuss with them. But we also just wanted to have an open door and offer an open opportunity for any members of the fishing community to come learn about what the roadmap is, where the opportunity is, and give us some feedback so that we can have as broad a perspective as possible to make sure that the roadmap is addressing the interests and concerns of the fishing industry. So July 9th and 10th, those are our meeting times. We've also been working with a tribal table off to the side of our roundtable conversations, where we invited the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon to have a separate conversation focused on their specific interests related to offshore wind and the roadmap. We've had a couple of meetings with them so far, and I have another draft, 25 pages of sections that are really just focused on that piece. The plan is to meld these by the time we get to the fall meetings. And so we're scheduling some additional meetings with the tribal representatives, and then would expect to be doing consultation as well as part of our development process. And the last thing I'll note, there was a grad class at Oregon State University in the Master Public Policy School that this spring had a focus on the Territorial Sea Plan and offshore wind. And they worked with Andy and I to identify some specific research questions that they could then chase down and bring us information that could inform the roadmap. One of those topic areas specifically asked them to look for where they might see gaps of their own as they reviewed Part 5 relative to offshore wind. And they did provide some good recommendations. I think the one that really stood out for the Part 5 piece was full life cycle analysis being one of the inventory and effect requirements for the information needs for Part 5, that it's kind of there tacitly, but that we could make it more explicit. They also looked at things like the handoff from BOEM to BSEE, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, and how any conditions the state places on BOEM would transfer over to BSEE. And they did a little bit of digging into the event that happened last year on the East Coast, where there was a blade failure on one of the turbines under construction, and what the coordination and process was like between the state and BSEE. There was another research topic area focused on the non-federally recognized tribes and engagement with them in our process and in offshore wind, generally speaking. And Andy, there was a fourth one, and I'm blanking on it right now. I don't know if you recall.
Let me quickly check. I actually have that presentation open.
While he's looking for that, I'll say that the class did an excellent job chasing down these topics. They provided a report to us with their findings that we'll be bringing that into the roadmap process as well. And then, well, I guess I do have one more thing to talk about. We have engaged with a consulting firm to help us with additional community engagement. They helped us with the public meetings. And then through the summer and fall, we're working on some focus groups and some additional group conversations with community-based organizations working along the coast, trying to broaden our reach to communities along the coast, especially historically underserved communities and just people who have not had the opportunity to participate in the roundtable process so far. And we're also looking to have some more targeted conversations. And at the moment, we're targeting like the tourism sector, ports and the maritime sector related to supply chain opportunities and development. And then also like coastal energy providers and related organizations to understand that piece so that we can get a little deeper in some areas of the conversation that our roundtable hasn't gotten around to yet. So that'll be happening in parallel. And I think that's the highlights, but I'm happy to go into anything further or answer any questions.
Jeff, let me just quickly follow up with you on the findings from that university project. There were two findings related to non-federally recognized tribes, basically, and I think you probably merged them mentally into one. Because states have different laws requiring engagement with federally recognized tribes, not all states do treat tribal governments in the same way, depending upon federal recognition or not. That's one. And BOEM engagement has varied between how they approach states, kind of taking some of those leads. Specifically, Oregon's non-federally recognized tribes face barriers when seeking to engage with government agencies. And their finding was they do have some best practices for engaging with tribes, but that doesn't say anything about kind of the legal framework or challenges associated therein.
And that's regarding specifically non-federally
Yeah.
designated tribes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they provided an example where at the Nekanicum Watershed Council, there is participation from North Coast peoples who are seeking federal recognition as a tribe, but that don't currently have it.
Mm-hmm. Looks like Justin has a question, comment.
Yeah, thanks. It's unrelated to that tribal piece. I didn't want to interrupt that. We good? I just wanted to.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just responding to you, Jeff. Appreciate the rundown. A lot of work's been happening. I also appreciate reaching out to us to try to help you reach out to the fishing community. We're making progress there. So wheels are in motion, and on that. And then also thank you for reaching out to the council. I know that you were willing to even travel to the last Fishery Management Council. Hopefully, I know that they were listening when you provided that comment. So I think that was great too. Just maybe want to highlight one other opportunity, if you're willing and interested, is just to give an update. Maybe not as detailed as this, but maybe an update on the roundtable to our Fish and Wildlife Commission. We have, and just looking at the schedules that might be most convenient, would be in August, we have one in Salem, and then in December, there's another one in Salem. So those probably would be the most, convenient for you. If you want, we could talk offline about how to get, it probably wouldn't get like a full agenda item. It might just be in public comment, period, which would be just like a 5-minute update or something like that. But I would, depending on, maybe at our agency leadership, maybe they'd like a little bit longer, a 10-minute, but it really kind of depends on the total agenda, which has largely been built out for August right now, and we might have a hard time squeezing in more than a 5 or 10-minute time. So let me know.
Me to do it.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions for Jeff?
Sorry, I don't have the raise my hand button handy. Just on your experience in that Brookings meeting, where you said there was a lot of misunderstanding. I heard a little bit about it. I wasn't there, but and the concerns. Were you able to separate, or at least funnel some of that energy, that negative energy towards offshore wind, into productive comments to help you provide information, provide the roadmap process, or was it? Or were they just, it was not really listening to you, what was going on? So maybe just, what was your impression of how that went down?
Sure. I would say that a lot of the oppositional comments were pretty positional in nature. You know, it's just, we're not interested. Were what some of the people were saying.
Right.
We met with one of the county commissioners down there who I think was active in the ballot measure that was passed down there last election season. And we've invited him to be on our roundtable, and now he's on our roundtable and providing good comments into that process. And so I think that the greater nuance and the question that I've continued to have around those ballot measures on the South Coast was, you know, they were worded in such a way to provide guidance to the county commissioners on what attitude to strike when it comes to offshore wind. And it was pretty, I would say, binary in nature to say, you know, the electorate voted that they should oppose BOEM's efforts for offshore wind. What I continue to wonder and have been asking and trying to understand better is that no forever, or no unless, or no until? Are there ways in which through our roadmap process, we can tease that apart and try to understand whether there is a viable path if it's walked in the correct manner? And I'm hopeful that the feedback that we're getting from our new roundtable member, and, you know, as people see the roadmap take shape, we may learn something, but it's difficult to have those more nuanced conversations. You know, how do you get a representative group of people together to have those conversations? You know, one thing I did hear in one of our meetings with staff was that one of the reasons why we shouldn't expect to see a lot of people at that meeting was that, at least among the fishing community down there and some others, you know, that they felt like they'd already spoken their piece and that
Right.
they didn't need to come and say it again.
Got it. All right. Yeah. Appreciate that. Thanks, Jeff.
All right. Well, thank you. Any last questions? We are a little bit behind on the agenda, but just want to open up for any final comments that people might have. And if there is more time at the end, if we get through the other agenda items faster, we can always circle back on this or questions. But maybe before, so I'm not hearing anything or seeing anything. So maybe before we go to the next agenda item, just gonna give Julia an opportunity to provide a bit more of a longer introduction for herself to everybody here on the call. So is that okay, Julia?
Yes, I was like snacking on something, but I can totally do that. Yeah, I'm Julia DeGraw. I'm the Senior West Coast Campaign Manager on the Offshore Wind team for the National Wildlife Federation. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, but I cover the whole West Coast region on this issue. And I'm an active participant in the Offshore Wind Roadmap Roundtable process, and I just saw that this meeting was happening and thought I would drop in and listen. But if you're interested in any input from me at any time, I'm happy to weigh in. I just mostly wanted to hear the discussion, though. So thanks for giving me a chance to introduce myself, Joe.
Yeah. Thanks, Julia. Okay, let's move to the next agenda item, which is Cynthia is going to walk us through that that document that you all received. So I don't know, Andy, if you want to share that at all, the screen. I know that the print's kind of small, but let me maybe we can zoom into it a bit. But
I think Cynthia's got some slides that are
Oh,
going to
okay,
highlight a
great.
few of the major points, and then we can dive into the document if we need.
Sounds perfect.
Yeah, and thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I have some slides, and it primarily just focuses on sections of the Territorial Sea Plan that has been noted in our applicable enforceable policies on that sheet. I know that spreadsheet is pretty hard to read. I gave you a PDF version of it, but I can open up an Excel version and also share an Excel version eventually. I just wanted to give you a perspective of how much we've been looking into this. So I'll share my screen and just go through some of the slides to give everybody a background. I think a good number of you know it already. Okay. So thanks for meeting today. So we are looking at the effects to coastal uses or resources. And I thought I'd put this slide up to show that we're not only looking at offshore components, but we have been looking at the effects for onshore components. And there is some overlay or overlap. Our focus today will be the offshore components and the effects to those coastal uses and resources in the territorial sea. We have looked at a variety of effects. This is just a list of the main headings. So we've looked at geologic resources, water resources, aquatic living resources, and terrestrial resources. Those two can include threatened and endangered species, critical habitat, and essential fish habitat. We've also grouped together aesthetic resources, recreation, which does not include fishing, and then land use. Cultural and tribal resources, and then socioeconomic resources and coastal uses that include fishing. Now and then we have some uncategorized stuff in there. I put the the Territorial Sea Plan, the parts that we found may be triggered to some degree if it's minor or if it's major in all those sections. So a lot of the Territorial Sea Plan touches every category. I'm not going to the spreadsheet breaks this into a much bigger, goes into much more detail of all the effects that we were looking at. I just wanted to give you an idea of the categories that we were looking at, and how the Territorial Sea Plan kind of touches a little bit of everything. Just to highlight our key enforceable policies, today we're just going to look at the statewide planning goal 19 just briefly, and then start diving into the Territorial Sea Plan. But this gives you an idea of the extent of the state's enforceable policies and what we've tried to look at when it comes to offshore wind development. So under goal 19, I'm just going to briefly cover this. Policy 1 we felt was applicable, but we did see that there was a gap that it doesn't specify water quality unless it's related to ecological effects. Just let you sit with that for a minute. I do want to mention that a good number of you, if you're on the round table, we've all worked through this table. We've kind of dove into some of these effects a little bit more in detail. And then Andy, Jeff, and I also sat down and tried to kind of figure out what parts of Goal 19 and the Territorial Sea Plan would apply to certain coastal effects.
Cynthia, did you want people to kind of comment along as you provide the presentation, or wait till after, or what was your thought?
It's open. So if you have comments, and I'll just I'll make my notes on a different sheet. Yeah, feel free. But what I could also do is we could go through this. Yeah, comment when you want. It's kind of free form, really. So if anybody has any questions, we can go into that. It's hard to talk about it and not have that spreadsheet in front of me. So we can, I'm trying to think of where goal 19 is going to be applicable. It's highlighted in certain sections, but it's not. So I just don't have all that memorized. So that if somebody wants to ask that kind of question, I'll have to look that up. Okay, I'm going to move on. So part 2, I'm starting with part 2, starting from the beginning. As we get into part 4 and 5, it gets a bit more detailed. And I'm not going to have the strengths, the gaps, the issues for 4 and 5 on my presentation. Just for 2 and 3, I believe, maybe a little bit in 4, because there's just a bit there. So I just wanted to highlight the sections of code that we the policies in part 2, 3, and 4, and 5 that we found applicable, and then where we found a place to strengthen, where there's a gap. So for part 2, we found that there's a part of 3, policy J, that could be put into part 2, and I highlighted that down here. And then also information requirements regarding water quality effects. And if Andy and Jeff, if you want to chime in, because I know you have more background in all this, because if it wasn't for you two, we wouldn't have put this all together. So yeah. So that's, I think, the only slide I have for part 2. There's not much for part 2 that we found gaps. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Andy, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. I don't think we envisioned using part 2 when we did our federal consistency review for the leasing action. But that is the main component of the Territorial Sea Plan that we fell back on when we were, because the activities that were described in the leasing process were really just placement of observational sensors or buoys, conduct of geophysical and other remote sensing surveys. So there was no specific tie back to the elements of an offshore development process. It was really just characterization of the system. And that's why we ended up using the policies within part 2 of the Territorial Sea Plan. And those are some of the oldest policies in the Territorial Sea Plan. They, I don't think, have been amended since they were adopted in 1994. So that framework, I think could have been improved. I think we brought an interpretation from part 5 into our review where we were trying to understand effects to the benthic environment, specifically of placement of structures in the system and having sensitivity around the relationship of that placement with rocky habitats, submerged rocky habitats or reefs. So we took an interpretation of that effect, which we thought of as the implementation of Goal 19 via that part of the Territorial Sea Plan, Part 5, and we were forecasting if there were to be anything development-wise that were to happen, with the placement of an anchor as an example, that we would want to apply that policy in Part 5. And so, our negotiations with BOEM allowed us to use that policy, but certainly in this instance, I think there is a significant gap in the water quality effects. I think you're right. The Goal 19 talks about the ecosystem structure and function more generally than just a potential impact to water quality. So I think it's a logical gap for us to think about if we can close it, by developing policy. So I think this is a good one that we've highlighted, and I think we might, as we think about future amendments to the Territorial Sea Plan, they may need to happen in more than one part of the Territorial Sea Plan, which is why, any future amendments for offshore wind may need to cross Territorial Sea Plan parts, or happen to more than one part of the Territorial Sea Plan. And that's a little bit different than we've done in practice, where we've really taken individual parts of the Territorial Sea Plan and made comprehensive amendments where those chapters have been out of date. So I think this is going to be potentially a different kind of structural amendment to the Territorial Sea Plan. And, you know, as we think about this, you know, one of the recommendations for the roadmap, I think, would be to amend any part of the Territorial Sea Plan where the scope or the effect could intersect with offshore renewable energy development more broadly. So I think that's an important point to bring forward here is that it's not just part 5, it's some of these other sections of language in other parts of the Territorial Sea Plan. And so the recommendation more broadly from the roundtable should be to address any part of the Territorial Sea Plan where an enforceable policy gap may exist. And the effort should be tailored in that way. So that's a little bit of, I think, framing and background that I think this gaps analysis has helped us to really understand the need for.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And that gives everybody more of a background. And I apologize for not providing that we did look at the whole Territorial Sea Plan for gaps because of exactly what Andy had mentioned. So that is why I am going through each part just to show you the relationships and how offshore wind development can touch every part. Is there any questions about part 2 or maybe the goal 19? Okay. I'll move on to the next one. So part 3 is rocky habitat management strategy. We had some recommended strengthening for when it comes to the benthic community. And this is the same one that we saw on the last slide where we add this policy J to part 2. And I can't remember, we have this section crossed out for a reason. Andy, do you remember why we were thinking of taking that out?
I can't remember exactly, but you know, just looking at the language here, part 2 in particular was a general like catch-all for other types of development or impact to the territorial sea. Right, it's the framing of how decisions will be made. It's you know, if you're talking about amendment of part 2, it's the framework that is required. So there's the resources inventory and effects evaluation that a company would be, or an applicant would be responsible for. And I think striking this section or that piece of language out would make it apply more broadly and make the policy a little bit more general,
Yeah.
which I think then potentially strengthens that, because there are, I guess that the main concern is there might be, you don't want there to be conflict between different parts of the TSP and how they deal with things, right? If part 4 has a requirement for a joint agency review team for decisions, just like part 5 does, you would want those practices to be consistent, and you would want the policies that they're using to evaluate the action to also be consistent. So that may be why, but I would need to go back to look at our work to really understand that.
Andy, that's my recollection as well.
Yeah, makes sense. So the policy A, B, G, and then the 6BB, I think it is. Hopefully I got that right. Those are the policies that we found applicable to some of the effects for offshore wind development. I can't remember exactly which ones, but those were the 4 main ones. So then the gap, and this was for the effect on geology by failed or sunken platforms, is to extend mitigation policies in this part, so it's applicable to undesignated rocky habitat sites. And once I get out of this PowerPoint, we can dive into the spreadsheet a little bit more. And I would think it's going to be helpful. I can send along the spreadsheet in Excel form so you can really get in there and add stuff or make comments. It's just to get your brain going, see if there's any comments right now.
I have a comment, Cynthia.
Yep.
I don't recall in TSP3 mitigation policies regarding sunken platforms for the designated rocky habitat sites. So I'm just curious, maybe, I mean, it's been a while since I've read this chapter closely, but I just can't remember if that's captured somewhere in one of the policies. Maybe Andy can help answer that.
Well, it's not specific to failed or sunken platforms. It's just mitigation, I believe, in general.
Oh,
Yeah, and so I think the idea is to extend those mitigation policies to the undesignated habitat sites. And just trying to see if it says it up here. Yeah, and I don't have that policy up in front of me. And Andy, do you remember what our thinking was on that one at all?
Well, one of the thoughts is the territorial sea is a dynamic system that has often places of rock that get covered and uncovered by the movement of sediments, mostly sand and mud. And so you may have habitats, rocky habitats in places that weren't officially thought of as rocky habitats previously. And so I think that this may be a reflection of that reality. Like we want to be able to mitigate for areas that we discover are rocky, even if they weren't previously that way. So that may be one of the rationale for that.
all right, thank you.
And I think my next one is 4. So my next several slides are just, there's quite a bit of part 4 for the uses of the seafloor that we pulled out and are referencing as key enforceable policies. And I think I've got these listed just in order. So this is a general section under C, and I'm just going to go, let's see. So we've got general policy language, then we have the implementation requirements and inventory content. And I'm just going to scroll real quick. We pulled out all these sections of code from Territorial Sea Plan Part 4 that we felt were applicable, but we didn't find much in the way of gaps or issues, except there's one that I have noted. So there's these policies regarding cables. I'm going to go down. We have this whole section quite a bit. Geologic hazards, biomimicry, seafloor, biological, all this fun stuff. Let me see what the next one is. We've got routing and landing also in there. Decommission and recovery is also important when it came to effects to coastal uses and resources. The only gap was back to water quality. But as you look through all this, you might find some more gaps. So we found that in parts 2, 4, and 5, information requirements do not specify water quality unless they have an ecological effect. And then we have this little comment here, develop standards that apply to survey activity. So I'm going to go back to the beginning here. Andy or Jeff, I don't know if you want to speak to Paul's part 4 at all.
Well, I would just say this is one of the most recent sections of the Territorial Sea Plan. So it is somewhat rewarding to realize that we don't have a lot of gaps in this chapter. That means we did a pretty good job when we were thinking about things just a couple of years ago. So the amendment to Part 4 was finalized in November of 2023. So I think that the group did a nice job of thinking through the different elements, and interesting to think about the intersection of water quality and Part 4, since it's really centered around infrastructure placement on or within the seafloor. But certainly there could be water quality effects if there were frac outs, as an example. But I would wonder, would that have an ecological effect that we would want to think of as a standard, right? And so what are the elements of a future offshore wind project that, you know, just for PacWave as an example, there were, you know, multiple cables installed for 4 different berths. My understanding is that there may be a certain number of cables that are installed to support an offshore wind project, and that could be a lot of horizontal directional drilling that goes from shore out to kind of the near shore portion of the territorial sea. So I think that's really where this gap is focused, and interesting to think about how you would write or develop a policy to fill that gap.
I wonder if it would be more of a more broad nature.
Laura, I saw you pop on video. I was wondering if you have thoughts on water quality related to infrastructure installation. Really, that's like the period of time within which the risk, like the environmental risk, would be most significant, right? As in the drilling process to get cables from shore out across the shoreline.
Yeah, I'm not sure about water quality issues per se. That would be more of a DQ question. But I mean, we did have multiple I guess they prefer to call them inadvertent releases.
That's right. Yeah.
During drilling process, including my larger concern related to my experience with that situation was in sensitive habitat. So in, you know, particularly sensitive wetland habitats, there could be disturbance to that area, and there was disturbance to those areas with the inadvertent release of the drilling material into the wetland. So, I mean, the material itself isn't, it's like, you know, not, I mean, it's not like a lot of chemicals or anything, but the sediment into the wetland could have had, if it was larger effect. I'm not sure what exactly you wanted for this discussion. related
No,
to
I think
that?
that's,
I mean, avoidance of sensitive terrestrial habitats, acknowledging that the likelihood of the inadvertent releases is high, I think is important for planning purposes. So avoidance, given that there's not much you can do when it happens, would be preferred.
I think the policy that's on the page there does a pretty good job of describing, you know, a planned route for drilling and highlights characterization in a way so that we hope to avoid those types of effects.
It's just that the horizontal directional drilling is seen as an avoidance technique largely, or that's what it's communicated as, but because they go under. But if the inadvertent release happens in certain types of habitats, then there is disturbance, even with it going under the system. I'm not sure at this level how you're going to get much more into anything that would solve that problem, but
Yeah, I think we've probably covered that one, Cynthia, if you want to move on.
Yep. Yeah, so that's good to hear that, as you said, it's rewarding that there's not many gaps in part 4. So part 5, there's quite a bit. Let me see how many. Yeah, look at all that. So just to run down the part 5, there's a lot of sections that are applicable. Under B4 implementation requirements, we've got, just trying to think here. I feel like this one was referenced a lot in our table, special resources and use review standards, G in general. And we referenced the siting and development requirements, fisheries use protection standards, and the protection of living marine organisms, and then also recreational resources down here at the bottom. These two things in the middle are just added in there for reference. And we also refer to project operation plan, contingency plan, adaptive management plan, and decommissioning, and also agreements. So there's quite a bit of part 5 that we've referenced in our table. Some of the gaps we have, just to jump right to those, is the ecological resource standard seems spatially limited. I think that's a big one. Vessel operation impacts are not explicitly called out. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment on this first one, the ecological resources standard. And I want to describe this in a way that we can hopefully clearly understand the issue. And that is that when the state built part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan, we conducted a pretty comprehensive resources and uses inventory. And the ecological resources in particular, we identified some as discrete resources, so they were easily mapped, identified. They were things like rocky reefs, kelp bed habitat, seabird, colonies, pinniped haulouts, and those mapped resources where we had concentrations of them became a portion of the actual plan document, which was the if you look at part 5, there is a plan map that has a set of distinct area types. And those area types went from what we called a resource and use conservation area. That was the highest concentration of resources, to areas that had slightly less. So resource use management area was areas where there weren't kind of discrete resources, but there were still some areas, some kind of concerns ecologically that you might be impacting organisms that were there, but that wasn't associated with a permanent structure. And so the standards that are for ecological effects were tied together with those areas. So if you look at our map, the standards apply to the different areas within the map. And because we did that, it makes it a challenge to think about understanding how you apply a similar ecological effect standard to places more broadly and generally, right? Areas outside of the territorial sea, which may have discrete ecological areas of concern, but that weren't mapped or designated as such. The state would still have a concern about impacts to those resources. But because the standards in the plan applied very specifically to those areas within the territorial sea, we thought that there may be a challenge to apply those policies out beyond. So I think that's the crux of this gap. Hopefully I said that in a way that it makes sense.
So, Andy, are you saying that then a recommendation to rectify that gap would be to ensure that the entire territorial sea boundaries are captured within this ecological resource concern?
It's maybe either to have a general ecological protection standard that applies more broadly across the territorial sea, or that we in some way can call out areas outside of the territorial sea that we would think of as a resource or use conservation area of importance. However, I think there's a couple different mechanisms to do that, right? There are federally recognized areas that are protected for certain types of uses as a part of the essential fish habitat process, as an example. And maybe calling out those areas within the Territorial Sea Plan specifically might be a way to get at applying those standards to an area beyond the Territorial Sea. Or if you separate the standard from the plan map, kind of disaggregate the two, that's another way to potentially to get at it. And since we haven't had a lot of what I would say interest or application of hydrokinetic energy within the territorial sea, it does make me question whether or not we need that plan map to be effective if we know what the effects are that we're concerned about, and we can just develop policies for those effects. So I think that's the conundrum that we face in terms of amending this part of our enforceable policies. Yeah,
So,
go ahead, Jeff.
I can just add, I think the question is, do you draw a box first and then make a standard for what's inside the box? Or do you make a standard that applies broadly? And then if you want to have more specific standards inside your boxes, you can go from there. What we were finding was that we have a really nice general standard, but we were putting it inside the boxes. And we didn't have one that was outside of the box, if that makes sense.
Did that answer your question, Joe?
yeah, I think so.
Okay.
That's a good way to frame it, Jeff. I was trying to find my unmute. I couldn't find it. Just a minute. So yeah, that one's a big one. We've called that one out a bit. And then we've got some more specific you know, whether we've got vessel operation impacts that are not explicitly called out. It might be helpful to have standards related to siting in areas of geologic instability. And we have this gap on also it goes to the terrestrial area as well, but it's definitely a concern in the sea. Maybe building on the decommissioning plan, having a waste deposition plan. So building that out a little bit more. We've got consider broadening part 5 to include survey activities preceding a facility.
Just one
Andy, go ahead.
example
Yep.
of a change that's happened in our kind of regulatory landscape in the last 5 years is the Southern Resident Orca Endangered Species Act designation. So, you know, when we think about vessel operation impacts or seasonal considerations, I could see us thinking about potential impacts on Southern Resident orcas. And those weren't called out anywhere in Part 5 because that Endangered Species Act designation hadn't occurred. So that may be someplace where additional thinking would be beneficial. So that's just one example, but there's likely others.
Yeah, good. Jeff?
I'd like to add a finer point to the mitigation piece, and forgive me, Cynthia, if you've already covered this. You know, we in Part 5 have this general ecological protection standard that says you shall have no significant adverse effect on ecological resources in these areas. And then we also, as kind of a larger principle in the policy section, section 2, say that you shall maintain and protect renewable marine resources by requiring that such actions avoid, minimize, rectify, restore, etc. So that's like our mitigation hierarchy that we have here in the state, how we apply that. What's missing is a link between the two to say, if you are following the mitigation hierarchy, then that can result in a determination that there is no significant adverse effect, that there needs to be like, if you otherwise would have a significant adverse effect, you can have a path through mitigation to potentially still move forward and just like have a discussion about what should be the appropriate linkage between these two concepts.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other thoughts before I exit out of this this PowerPoint?
Well, one thought about the survey activities preceding a facility is that, you know, one of the things that our NOAA enforceable policies requires that we are not discriminatory in any way against a specific user type or group. And so I could see there being a challenge if we are only applying standards for surveying to offshore wind developers or wave energy developers. And we're not applying those same survey standards for other types of surveys that may occur in our ocean and occur all the time as a result of study or other research projects. And so I think this one may be a challenge, and it may be that it shouldn't be in Part 5. It should be in a more general section of the Territorial Sea Plan. Part 2 comes to mind. But I want to, you know, when I mentioned at the beginning that we used Part 2 when we were doing our federal consistency review, it would have been very helpful to have that content in Part 2 So I think we want to think strategically about how we think about standards associated with surveying, because I think we want surveys to occur so that we can understand our ocean and understand geological or geophysical types of habitats. But we cannot be discriminative against a certain user. So that's a challenge with thinking about filling that gap. Is let's do that in a way that makes sense and doesn't impact just general observational practices.
Natalia?
Can you hear me?
Oh, a little bit. It's your little.
A little bit? I don't know. Sometimes it's like off, sometimes it's on, and Zoom is here. But you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah, it's just a little muffled.
I don't know.
Just try, and we'll see if we need you to repeat yourself.
Oh. Is it better now?
Sounds fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So I don't remember for part 4 regarding vessel separation impacts. Did we address that gaps as well? Because Andy, you mentioned orca, Southern resident orcas, yes, and like all agency development management plan or MEMAS right now. But it also, and orcas, so they design Southern resident orca as endangered species in February 2024. So it was after we amended part 4. But I don't remember, did we consider the vessels impact there already? Because it's also sighting cables, vessels also needing the air. It just, if it's not, then we maybe can align in the future.
I don't know. I was just trying to pull that up. That's a good point.
I think we talk about this because it's still like cable, landing, burial, installation. But yeah, I'm wondering specifically to endangered species and orca particularly. Or maybe it could be just reference in part 5.
I think we talked about vessel timing
Yeah, I think so.
for installation of cables because of the potential conflict with fisheries.
And speed limitation, yeah, I remember.
Yeah, but I don't think we talked about speed limits or the impact of noise on habitats. And that is one of the biological effects of concern is noise to southern resident orca, because they are using echolocation and to hunt, and so I'd have to go back to look at that, Natalia. I think it's an interesting question. But I think in general, we want to be able to establish standards and or practices that we think would minimize potential effects or impacts. So we would want to make sure that we can address that when we're thinking about any infrastructure placement or installation.
I know Jeff and I talked about speed, and I don't have my notes. Is Jeff still in here? It's in my notes somewhere, but I forgot to put it on here. We did look into speed. We didn't know if that was possible. And then we do have a effect of interest when it comes to noise. And I was just trying to look that up. But Jeff, do you remember our discussion about speed?
I know that on the East Coast, there was a 10-knot speed limit put on boats, and it was related specifically to the right whale. And then California successfully had a 10-knot speed limit in their conditions on leasing. And so we decided to follow suit with a condition for the Oregon Federal Consistency Review. I believe we based it on just goal 19 as a top level policy without having any more specific policy under it. So the idea would be we could be more specific in part 5 if we so chose. We could just kind of take the approach we took last time. It makes me think, though, there are a number of boats out there not related to offshore wind that don't have speed limits, and I think it's an interesting policy question to consider. And I don't know what information we would need to make an informed decision there.
I have just a quick layer to add on to this specific topic. I was at the Pacific Offshore Wind Summit in California, which is pretty developer heavy, and there was pretty open complaining on the stage from folks giving presentations from that community about the unfair higher standard that offshore wind is expected to meet. And in the conversations that advocates, particularly conservation and environmental advocates, were having with the state agency folks in California, were centered on urging them to not reduce their standards for offshore wind. And if anything, the state needs to be exploring, if you want to be more consistent in your policies, how do we raise the standards for other industries to meet this scientific basis, you know, for what is actually protected for species. And there's a conversation that is happening with agencies pretty consistently and with elected officials in California is, how do we approach developing a new industry, especially in places like Humboldt Bay area, where it's a lot of mitigation of harm from previous development, but like basically saying, how can we approach a new industry in a way that avoids the harms of past industries, right? So we're not cleaning up messes in the future. So I think, yeah, but anyway, that's something that they're definitely grappling with in California is the tension that's created by creating a higher standard for this new industry. But I think it's something that they're definitely leaning into, and the agency has made it clear that they were not uncomfortable with having that inconsistency in terms of having a higher standard for this, you know, compared to other industries. I hope that was a clear answer and that this was helpful, but it was coming up in a very timely manner recently, and I thought it might be useful for this conversation.
Andy?
Yeah, I was just wondering, and this is just me thinking out loud here, but you know, the effects of a vessel at a small size, if there's a strike, would be very different than there's at a larger vessel size. So maybe there's some speed limits by vessel size and type that you could apply consistently across the spectrum of types of marine navigation transportation that would get at this issue, Julia, rather than lowering the standard for new offshore wind. You're raising the standard for everybody else because you realize that there's problems with the way things have been handled already. So that could be one approach.
There's one more additional tidbit. I want to jump in real quick, Natalia. It's specific to this topic, which is there was voluntary compliance with developers on the East Coast. I forget which project for this speed limit. And there were extenuating circumstances about a specific time period with a specific kind of boat that they had to be able to use, that when it goes at that speed makes their workers sick. And like there's a whole, like, they had a very specific issue for a limited period of time where they had to use a certain kind of boat. And there was a contractual agreement between the developers and ENGOs, and they made kind of an exception for this one period of time for this one need that they had. And so I don't know if policy can be drafted in that way, where it's like there is a solution in a case-by-case basis if there's a very specific need that a developer has. But I think I don't know, I'm sure the way to not design policy that allows for the necessary flexibility for like realities, but I just want to list that as another example of like a contingency that came up that was challenging, but they all collectively maintained that agreement, didn't break the contract, but created a small exception for a limited period of time. But okay, I can stop.
Good context. I think it's not a very clear issue on how to resolve it at the moment. And maybe there's a future study that could help to inform that.
Natalia, you want to?
Yeah, just to the same point that Julia, Jeff, and Andy mentioned regarding the speed limitation. When I was in the International Partnering Forum for Offshore Wind in Virginia, so I talked to Virginia. They do have this 10-knot speed restriction, but yes, it depends on type of the vessels. So they're not applied to all vessels. Also, seasonal one, and this we may address, like create some, policy framework for that in the future in part 5. But it should be kind of guidelines with this type of vessels. And yes, Julia mentioned seasonal interaction, because if we consider any endangered species, like whales or southern resident orca, we should consider any construction or installation and vessels movement during migration period. So that could be maybe for, if we know in this specific months, there is a migration for whales and different types, orca as well. We may also address, depends on the seasons and type of vessels. At least just to say from maybe give a range or less than that number of knots, and for other vessels it's different 10 knots for heavy one, and etc. Yeah, but they do have this gradation and classification for different type of vessels. Thanks.
You said that was in Virginia, Natalia?
Yeah, when we had this offshore trip to see offshore pilot project, so like they did presentation about construction and etc. And I specifically asked that question about speed limitation, and this is why they mentioned that, yeah, we have 10 knot speed limit, but it's mostly for the heavy vessels, not for beach vessels. And they have this gradation type.
I think there's a good recommendation for a study. What are the sensitivities of the species we find off of Oregon? And if they had specific standards for designed for right whales, maybe there's specific standards for gray whales, or humpbacks or blues, which are all off our shore depending upon the seasonality.
Any other questions? Or I was thinking of bringing up the spreadsheet, if that helps. Just kind of go through these in a little bit more detail, or anything that somebody wants to talk about too.
Well, Joe, maybe we should talk about the goal of the work group here before we continue to dive into specifics. Right, I think one of the goals was that we, through our initial kind of thinking about this, would be able to inform OPAC as to recommendations that would end up being acted upon at a full OPAC meeting, and then transmitted over to Jeff when he's kind of working on the roadmap. So should we be thinking about broad areas of recommendation? Should we be calling out specific? I'm interested in kind of what this group thinks of as a work product that would be most valuable for OPAC and then valuable for Jeff. He's already put in the chat, we're not at this time going to solve the gaps, because we will need to go through rulemaking amendment process to do that. So our target in my mind is these are the broad general areas. These are some of the maybe the scope and what we might envision would be an appropriate timeline to think about acting upon. Jeff, other thoughts that you have for us in terms of, you know, what's valuable for you to come out of an OPAC recommendation around the roadmap?
You know, I guess, well, like we didn't talk about the visual standards either. Like that could be part of this as well. And, you know, we talked about that at our roundtable meetings, that there are viewshed protection standards that
Oh,
could be
and
a significant piece of all this.
I may have missed that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, all good.
It's on
And
there.
then the cultural resource, yeah. You know, gosh, what would be good? I think, you know, on some level, it's helpful to just understand what would be necessary and involved in a rulemaking undertaking. And so, in a way, having OPAC provide a gut check to say, based on the scope of potential gaps, here's what we see would be needed to support rulemaking to address these topic areas. That could be kind of an interesting exercise for you all to do, to say, if this dropped on the plate of OPAC in a year or 2 years, to say, here are the topic areas that we want you to look at and consider whether policy change ought to happen, and if so, how. Tell us what resources you would need. Tell us what information you would need to support the decision, the conversation to make those decisions. And that would help us then put in the roadmap what a reasonable resource expectation would be, just the general scope of the rulemaking, that it could be a little bit of collaboration to decide what the actual scope charge to OPAC could entail. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And also, it feels like it could be a pretty, like the timeline will be important to figure out if OPAC was actually going to tackle these updates, because it applies across most of the chapters. It sounds like we're talking here, maybe less so on TSP4, but and we all know how long it took for TSP3 to be updated, but that was a major overhaul. I think what we're talking about here are really specific to renewable energy, although we'll have to be careful about how it has repercussions for other industries and other issues. So it would take a while, because, you know, multiple years, but at the same time, it's going to take multiple years for any offshore wind development to actually happen. So I think trying to like lay a timeline of what would be needed for OPAC to set up work groups to go through each of these chapters, or maybe can do multiple chapters at a time, specifically focusing on this issue. And then how does that align with the, you know, not just the roadmap, but also, I guess it's an unknown at this point, given our federal situation on where offshore wind will go, but certainly trying to have some type of draft timeline will be important for both these processes and moving forward there. So I think that would be one major thing that could help both OPAC and the offshore wind process in tandem.
Yeah, if I may, as a staff for OPAC, you know, one of the first things I need to do in my duties as a part of the department is I need to take the initiation of the rulemaking proposal to my agency's commission. So that does need to have broadly a scope and a timeline, potentially resources that are going to be necessary. And so if this working group process, you know, can help to generate that justification and background, I think that would help us a lot as an agency, because we will then know what we need to plan for. If there are studies that are really important that need to be done you know, ahead of a rulemaking amendment, then we'd have to stage those. And there could be some, I guess you could do some technical enhancements or upgrades first, and then you could do studies and come back. Like there's a number of ways I think that we could try and structure work that we do. You know, certainly I think in the, you know, well, it's anyone's guess in the next 4 years what's going to happen with offshore wind. But the signs as of this year have been that there's no emphasis on that, and funding to support federal agency involvement and participation and improvements to any of the process are going to be non-existent. So I do think that's a very valuable exercise. You know, I think what Jeff described, you know, what are the actions, what are the scope, what are the parts of the Territorial Sea Plan, how long might those take? If we can work on generating that as a work product that OPAC would review, I think that'd be a very valuable function for this group.
Would it be helpful for everybody to look at this in more, if you have time, to look at our list of effects and see if there's something that you want to add or understand more about it? And I could send along the Excel spreadsheet so you can dive in a little differently, maybe add comments. With that, I think it would help our evaluation to have your opinion in there as well, and give you more of an understanding of the depth that we're looking at.
Yeah, I think you should definitely, well, you've already provided it to this work group, but maybe put a deadline on us to review it and make sure we, you know, provide you the comments that we come up with in a timeline that's reasonable.
I know that PDF, I mean, you have to zoom in quite a bit to look at it, but if it is helpful, I can also send along the Excel spreadsheet, and then you could write comments right in there.
I think that'd be best, yeah.
Okay, I'll send that to Andy and he can pass it along. Yeah, because we didn't cover everything, and like Jeff had mentioned, and I failed to put in my slide there, is that, yeah, there's also the visual aspect, cultural, tribal resources that we're looking at needing to capture as well.
And Jeff, I know you've had the roundtable go through this table with Cynthia before, and I assume it'll happen it'll happen more. And will it be a part of the draft that you create during the summer, that the full draft? Is that your intention to have this built in there as like an appendix or something?
So yes, the intent is to have the full meal deal of, you know, here are all the gaps we identified, here are the policies that we already have on the books, here are areas where we found specific gaps. In the main body of the roadmap document, we're thinking of making just like a strategy table that says, let's just extract the gaps that we've identified, that we can agree, like, these are the things that future policy making can or should address. And then it could be like, what is the gap? Where is the part of Oregon's policy set where action would need to be taken? And then, like with, if you all took that to the next step to say, what is the timeline? What is the resource need, et cetera? Like, that could be kind of an interesting way to just have a single strategy for how the state's going to address its gaps. And what I'm showing on the screen right now is from the May discussion draft that's on our roadmap website. And it's a couple of pages of first cut a gap strategy table that we need to be, you know, building out.
So thinking about timeline, Joe, I just put the next window of time that we want to be able to potentially schedule our meeting. And I think we organize this around having our meeting a couple weeks ahead of the OPAC meeting on October 29th. So we were thinking about that when we set out this date range. And I think it would be great if we came back at that meeting with a response to the question you just asked. Are there gaps that we haven't, that we can identify afresh, basically? Is there anything we need to add? Because then I think after that point, we have done our best to wrap our arms around the universe of potential tasks associated with TSP amendment. And that would then lend itself to kind of that structural organization of thinking about how we actually go about filling those gaps and the scope and timeline that would be associated therein. But that's a lot to do for one meeting. So that is maybe.
So are you thinking a two-step process here is what I'm hearing? Like from now until that early fall meeting, we just get folks' comments on the gaps, and then after that, once we have that compiled, then we go into that step of figuring out what our action scope and timeline are for actually updating the TSP chapters regarding this issue.
Well, maybe, yeah. I think you could do this two ways. I think one is that, this is something that, if everybody responded by email about any new gaps that are identified, we can basically do the staff work to get that back to you all as a group. And then we could, Jeff, Cynthia, and I could put our heads together and think from our agency perspective, the timelines and the potential actions that we would need to scope, to do the work. So I'm thinking at that October meeting, that would be a draft product for this working group to review. The other option is to do what you said and have there be that discussion around the gaps at the next meeting, and then kind of
I like your initial, just
from a
just
timing
keeping things
perspective.
moving.
Yeah, it's summer, so getting people together again for another working group meeting before October may be a challenge. But yeah, I guess that's logistically how I'm thinking about things, is if we can give everyone it's almost July. If we give everyone a month to do their review of the table or the products that we've provided, the staff could pull all that stuff together into more of a comprehensive but generalized list. And then we could start to try and identify those timelines and other tasks that would be necessary to complete that. And that could be something that this group could review in October ahead of the OPAC meeting.
Does that work for everybody on the call, and specifically, I wonder for Jeff and Cynthia, especially Jeff, who's gonna be writing the roadmap and then putting this on top. Is that something that's feasible, Jeff? And
Well, I was going to actually ask for a comments around that time frame. So thanks, Andy, because I'd like to try to put everything together by September, so then Jeff can incorporate that into his document. I'd like to try to wrap a bit of it up in September, probably by the end of September. I don't have a set date, but yeah, so 1 month out would be good, and then I can incorporate that into our information that we have already.
So it sounds like we may naturally be kind of coalescing around that timeline anyways. And this would be kind of one kind of perspective slice of the tasks. So I don't know, I feel comfortable like in me working with Cynthia and Jeff to take the lead on something to bring back to this group at the beginning of end of September, beginning of October.
Okay, is everybody fine with that?
Yeah, works for me.
Sounds good.
And it
Thanks.
looks like that timeline is still good. There's an invasive species training a couple of those days, but I'll send the doodle poll around and we'll find a date that'll work for the most number of people. At this time, I think we should be able to get something on the calendar. And it maybe needs to be a 3-hour meeting if we're going to try and get to a point that we can have something for OPAC that'll be ready.
So just to clarify the timeline a bit here, so we're going to have about a month for everybody on this work group to review the gaps table that Cynthia has, get our comments into you, and then you, Cynthia, and Jeff will take that and develop a more of a draft timeline and scope of what it would take to work on the TSP items related to that, and then then in that time frame in September, this group would meet for a longer session, and then we would have finalize that document, and then bring it to OPAC, the OPAC meeting. Okay.
With the small correction that I'll probably take the lead on working with Cynthia and Jeff to do the scope and timeline task.
Okay.
Just as my staff support role for OPAC.
Okay. All right. Well, sounds like everybody's fine with that. And I don't know if there's anyone here for public comment. I don't know if anyone wants to give any public comment.
Yep, now would be the time, but we've got Julia, Dick, and Kate as our non-working group members here. So any comments, you guys?
I just spoke up freely in the meeting because no one told me I couldn't. So thank you for that. And I was just going to say thank you for letting me crash your meeting and listen in and chime in. I appreciate it. And I learned a lot. It was really I really appreciate everyone being so thorough and thoughtful in your approach. So thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Anybody? Dick?
I'll just say something similar. I really appreciate you taking the time to go over these issues, and I thought it seemed like a real thoughtful discussion, and recognizing you have some work to do. I like the fact that you're looking into these gaps that we thought we'd filled lots of these aspects in the TSP, but we always seem to uncover some more. But I think that's great you have some time to work through that. So thanks again for making the meeting available to all of us in the public.
All right. Thank you, Dick.
Yeah, it's Kate gonna say thank you too. I'm working on looking at the governance process for this offshore wind in Oregon, and it was really helpful to listen to you today.
Thank you, Kate. Well, with that, we're done with
Laurel has her hand raised.
I was just hoping, since we're a small group, maybe we could just pick a date instead of doing another doodle. I mean, I get like a doodle like every day. I'm just maybe we could do. I don't know if it's possible, but sometimes with a small group, it's quicker to do it that way than everybody doing the dueling doodles. I don't know. Maybe it's impossible, but sometimes I've seen it happen, like in like 1 minute, and it's like we picked a date. And that would maybe save everybody some time.
Everybody look at your calendars and see.
And I would focus on like probably 3 hours in the morning and in the or afternoon. I've got September 30th in the morning and afternoon wide open.
Natalia said something about not until after the 1st, but I don't. Oh no, I can't hear her.
Oh no, Natalia, you're having your audio problem here.
Try your other microphone.
Again, can you hear me
There you
now?
go.
There you are.
You see, once I turn off, then I just have difficulty to return. Yeah, I will be on vacation till October 1st, so I will be available after that.
Friday the 3rd?
I am on a field trip for the Oregon Forest Practices Mitigation Committee through the 3rd. So it would have to be the week of the 6th.
How about
Me.
Tuesday the 7th?
Works for me.
I think I could do either the morning or the afternoon.
Uh, yeah, it works for me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
It works for me. In the morning is better because we have DSL all staff meeting in the afternoon.
How about 9 to noon on the 7th, Tuesday, October
Sure.
7th?
Works for me. How does it work for everybody else?
Yeah.
Thank you for the suggestion, Laurel. If I
Just
don't
like
have to, if
getting
I
it
don't
out
have
of
to
the
do
way,
another
yeah.
doodle. Yep.
Well, you know, Andy, there are people who are not at this meeting that
That's
would,
true.
Right.
Yeah,
we
Tara
would
is not
hope
here.
that they would be at the next meeting. So maybe you can just throw that out to the group as a
Yeah.
placeholder and see if it works.
Thank you
Yeah.
for reminding
Do we
us,
pick an
Justin.
alternate date just in
Yeah,
case?
an alternate for Tara, maybe.
Would be Wednesday the 8th.
I can't do that.
Nope.
I can't either.
I could do the 9th.
I could do the 9th.
Do the 9th in the afternoon.
Sure.
That works for me.
Like 1 to 3 works well for me. Or 1 to 4, I guess it would be.
I will. I will send an email around with these two options. And see if one of those works better. But I have Tuesday, October 7th, 9 to noon, and Thursday, 1 to 4. Okay.
Good.
Excellent.
All right. Well, I think we can adjourn. See you. Andy, do you want to stay on for a sec? I just want to chat with you about a couple things.
Yeah, sure, I can, Joe.
Okay. Thanks. See
Bye-bye.
ya.
Let me